Tacos is essentially an acronym for Terraform Automation and Collaboration Software. There's lots of platforms out there that can automate Terraform, like general CI/CD and stuff like that. But a Tacos platform specifically is a platform designed and purpose-built to automate the life cycle of Terraform. Not just, with CI/CD, it's kind of stateless, it runs the pipeline and it's done with it. Well, with the Tacos platform, it's stateful because Terraform is stateful. So we're really focused on the entire life cycle from deploy to destroy. And when you talk about Tacos platforms, there's really only 4 of us in the group: env0, Spacelift, Scalr, and of course Terraform Cloud.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting. We'll talk a little bit about how env0 compares to those other solutions a little bit later. Luckily, you're the only tacos to appear today, so we'll be very pro env0 on the stream. So, can we talk a little bit about one of the problems that I got my start in Terraform as a sort of DevOps engineer. I remember one of my first interviews was, look, we don't care anything else that you know how to do, just as long as you can do our Terraform, right? Yeah. If you could do that, you're hired. So I said, okay, yeah, sure, one of the problems as a DevOps engineer that I kept sort of running into with Terraform was that it was quite easy to get started with Terraform, but then somebody else, some other engineer might poke it or prod it or do a manual change in the cloud, and then suddenly you do a second run, and now you have to do state surgery. Can you maybe sort of explain the process of state surgery, and then afterwards explain how env0 can help there?
Exactly right. So state surgery it's so bad. It's awful. Having to go through and essentially manually edit your state file so that it coincides with what's actually deployed, it's not common practice, but it happens a lot, and it's really bad. It's a pain. Nobody likes to see that. The way that we help solve that problem is with drift detection. So drift is essentially the word that stands for the difference between what's in the state file and what's actually in the cloud. So instead of verifying the state and modifying the state, we like to come from the other side. So what we'll do is when we enable drift detection on a workload, we're going to go through and we're going to run a Terraform plan every hour, every day, every week, however much you think you might need it, and we're going to tell you, hey, this is drifted. Best practices with Terraform is your Git repository, whatever that code is in there, that is your single source of truth. Whatever is in that repository is what production should look like. If somebody's going in and editing stuff in the cloud, that's not correct. So what you should be doing at that point is then redeploying, making it back to what it should be so that you clear that drift. Then do it correctly. Open up a pull request, change the code so that it matches, merge that back, and make that redeploy. So drift detection for us, it's a big deal. Lots of folks are using it. It's pretty much the default. And it just helps you make sure that what matches the Git repository, what matches the state, what's out in the cloud.
Interesting. So you mentioned that env0 can sort of run on a timer and continuously run those plans, ensure that state hasn't drifted. Is env0 then able to sort of notify, let's say like for chat ops, are you able to get a hook into Slack and notify the team when drift is detected?
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So you actually just said 2 words there. You said Slack and you said team, but what about Microsoft Teams? You're right over there, they'd love us to talk about it. So we actually have chat ops with Slack and with Teams. You can set up the webhooks, get the notifications, not just that something's drifted, but also it will let you know, like when somebody's deploying something new, it will say, so-and-so started a deployment in production of this template. It's got a nice little link. You can click to it, you can go see what's going on, especially if you've got, like for production, where you have things set where it requires an extra set of approvals. You don't want to be sitting around looking at a dashboard all day waiting for something to approve. So not only will we send you an email letting you know that, hey, you've got something to approve, we'll shoot you a message on Slack, we'll ping you and say, hey, you've got something that needs to be approved. You click that button, it automatically takes you straight into the UI. It pulls up the plan so you can look at the plan. Right underneath that is going to be our infra cost run, so you can see how much that change is going to cost you. And then you've got a perfect access right there to the approve button so that you can either approve it or deny it and let it go.
Yeah, you mentioned infra cost.
Yep.
That's really interesting, and they're a partner of yours, I believe,
Yes.
providing that sort of cost estimation. I mean, one of the things I've seen at actually my last company was just ballooning cloud costs, and we didn't have a FinOps team, so management would just ping us every month and ask us sort of desperately, why has our cloud spend gone up 33%? And we weren't really able to tell them because we weren't FinOps. We were really part of the DevOps team that was just deploying the infrastructure, right? So that's something that doesn't really come with Terraform.
Yep.
And can you explain that a little bit more, that feature?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and in fact, something that differentiates us from the other tacos platforms is we're not just doing cost estimation, we're doing the total cost. So, all of our competitors, and some of them actually running infra cost, they're able to estimate, so whenever you have a plan run, it'll tell you, hey, this is what it's probably going to cost you to deploy this application. Our thing is on the other side of that, what is it actually costing you? So we have an open source piece of our platform called TerraTag that during the deployment we will tag all of the taggable resources, deploy them out into the cloud, and then with read-only access to your billing API, we can then scrape those tags and be able to tell you not only what the estimation is, but what the actual cost is. The reason that those two numbers might be different is usage. For things like Lambda functions and stuff like that, you don't really know how much it's going to cost you until you instantiate the instance and run the thing a million times.
Right.
So it's good to know, hey, this is what we think it's going to cost you, this is what it's actually costing you. So for us, it's just an overall picture to help you make a better decision on if you should hit that approve button or not.
And that not only cost estimation, but actual cost, that's something that's exclusive to env0 then?
Yes, so we're the only ones in our little niche group that are doing the actual cost after the fact and not just doing cost estimation before.
Interesting. What would you say that the biggest value add to a customer, or it can also be your favorite feature of env0, would be for the audience? If somebody's wondering, okay, how, it could also be, how am I going to sell this to the uppers? The infra cost sounds like a great way of as we were speaking of off camera earlier, selling up.
Exactly.
But what would you say your favorite feature is from a DevOps engineer's perspective?
So my favorite feature is kind of our secret sauce, and that's our custom flows. We have the ability to drop a YAML file inside of the repository and script it to say, at any point in this process, like say before the Terraform plan, after the Terraform plan, after a successful deployment, we can script in bash commands to just do literally whatever you want. So if we're talking about things like continuous verification, we're able to come through and make a budget check and say, hey, how much is this costing you? Are we within budget? Otherwise we'll cancel out. Also, if you want to utilize third-party services to bring security into the picture, like TFSec, or if you want to run checkoff by bridge crew, if you want to run open policy agent, we're able to help you script in pretty much any tool you want into any part of the process, so that we can be extensible for all of those other different teams. If you want security, you want networking, you want anybody else that's involved in the process, great. String that into every single deployment so that, like you mentioned earlier, you don't get yelled at by finance before, because if you shift that stuff left into the deployment process, you're going to know about issues before they happen instead of after.
Right. You mentioned scripting into, for example, Open Policy Agent by Styra, I believe, right? Is that the company that's?
Yeah. So a lot of the folks at Styra work on upstream Open Policy Agent.
Right. What's the USP of something like Open Policy Agent for DevOps teams? Why would they want to ensure permissions, or maybe we could step back a little bit and explain sort of what Open Policy Agent is trying to do.
So Open Policy Agent is policy as code. You have security that's telling you, hey, you can only do this kind of firewall policy and stuff like that. Well, it's a little bit different than Open Policy Agent. You can do security with it, but it's also compliance, it's guardrails and things like that. So for instance, if you have compliance needs where you only have to stay in a certain region in AWS, or if you only want to control like costing by saying they can only deploy small, medium, and large instances and not extra large, Open Policy Agent allows you to write specific policy and essentially guardrails so that every single one of those deployments checks, makes sure that it's within that policy, and then it will either continue or not. And the good news about that is that it's not just a bunch of like set parameters. This is pretty much write policy for anything you want. As most of us know, if you're going out and deploying stuff into the cloud, you know, you want, say, a new EC2 instance from AWS. There's a million different options that you go through when you click through that. All of that could have a policy written, like that has to be enabled or that has to be disabled. No open CIDR blocks inside of your VPCs and stuff like that.
Or don't deploy the default.
Exactly right. And it allows you to make sure that you're keeping those guardrails on and staying secure every single time so that you don't get yelled at a month later when somebody finds out.
And how does that sort of weave in with env0? Because I believe that env0 has been pushing that feature ahead as something that they support.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's one of those things where when we start working with customers and figuring out what their needs are and solving their problems, we end up having to go in for things like a security review and working with the networking team to figure out what they want to do. When you're working with any automation product in general, there's going to be a lot of different stakeholders involved, because in order to get an entire application or service out the door, there's a lot of different folks involved. With Open Policy Agent, that helps make sure that you're giving your compliance folks and your security folks and everybody the warm and fuzzies that while they are kind of letting go of the reins, so to speak, to allow people to deploy what they want when they want, they know that their parameters and their rules are still going to be met.
Interesting. Can we compare env0 to some of the other tacos? For example,
yes.
Maybe we can start, actually, HashiCorp is right behind us.
This is perfect.
Yeah.
Everybody say hi. I'm a Hashi ambassador. It's all right.
HashiCorp, of course, as authors of Terraform, open source, widely used within the industry. I would say it's sort of industry standard for infrastructure as code.
It is.
And one of their business-oriented products is Terraform Cloud, which is sort of on top. It allows you to do things like you can toss in secret variables in there that you wouldn't otherwise commit to code. You can do GitOps style deployment runs. Now, unfortunately, Terraform Cloud is very expensive. I mean, actually, most HashiCorp enterprise products.
Yes.
I mean, I once tried to sell Vault to my last company, and the finance team just couldn't understand how it could be so expensive.
Exactly right.
It was right up there with Datadog, if not more expensive than Datadog. So I'm sure we have some horror stories to share there. But I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that env0 not only gives you a broader feature set, but is also generally priced lower. Is that correct?
Yes, we absolutely are. And with us, we call ourselves the tacos for the Terraform Automation Collaboration, but we don't just focus on Terraform. We are extensible with Pulumi. If you want to use TerraGrunt, if you want to use, CloudFormation templates. As of this week, we're announcing native Kubernetes support for utilizing kubectl for deployments and things like that.
Oh, that's interesting.
But when it comes to cost, I love HashiCorp. They're great. They have done so much for the community and everything like that with Terraform, but they have what I like to call the open source problem. Funding the maintenance of Terraform open source that doesn't make them any money is very expensive. Now, there's only one business way to solve that. The products that you sell, they're going to be a little more overpriced to offset that.
Right.
And I'm sure if they didn't have to do that, they wouldn't do that, but it's just kind of a thing that they have to deal with. But that means we get to reap the benefits of that, and we just get to utilize Terraform open source without actually having to pay for it.
Right.
So it's one of those things where all of the other tacos platforms are going to be cheaper simply because we don't have to maintain Terraform open source.
That's a really good point, and not something I had considered.
Yeah, it's not cheap. They have entire groups of some of the greatest engineers on the planet working on that, and they're paying them to work on a free product.
Yeah, right. Well, so how would env0 then compare to some of the other tacos? For example, like Spacelift.
Sure.
We were supposed to get an interview with them today, but they weren't able to fit it in their schedule. Otherwise, it would have been an interesting, a little head-to-head. But
that's great. I'll have to thank them later.
Yeah, absolutely. So Spacelift, Scalr,
yep.
And who else am I missing?
So it's Scalr, Spacelift, Terraform Cloud, and us are the four tacos specifically.
How do you think that, or how would you say that env0 compares to Spacelift and Scalr?
Sure, and one of our distinguishing things is UI UX. We are heavily focused on the user experience. We want everything to be as easy as possible. That's one thing with Scalr. Scalr is very extensible. Their UI and UX is not great, but the people that like Scalr don't really care about that. The same can kind of be said for Spacelift, and we end up going against Spacelift more often than not. And with that, we kind of have two different methodologies and kind of the way that we go about. Even though we solve the same problems and a lot of things we do the same, their UI is much different. The way that they operate is a little bit different. We like to make sure that we're not going to be prescriptive. We're not going to tell you that you need a mono or a multi-repository strategy. We're not going to tell you that you need to do your modules in a certain way. We're not going to say what your workflow looks like. We like to be able to be as easy as somebody would want us to be, or as complex as they need us to be, with our extensibility and everything like that.
So you would say that Spacelift is more prescriptive, whereas env0 strives to be, let's say, more agnostic to
Sure.
the different styles of...
To a degree, and it's also just kind of, the nomenclature, the way things are set up and everything like that. Like, all of our stuff is based off of the dry methodology, or don't repeat yourself. So, like, all of our variables, we want to make sure that those are scoped in a bunch of different locations, so that if you need global, you can have it. If you need specific variables for that one deployment, you can do that. With our template structures, we make sure that you can set up those templates so that they can be reused over and over and over again. That's a big thing with like Terraform Cloud. It's really difficult to duplicate a workspace. So if, say, you want to use the same Terraform code across production and staging and development, copying that workspace is difficult. Now, you can script it with the API and make all of those variables copy and stuff like that. But we're really, really focused on making you, if you're going to use something multiple times, we only want you to set it up one time and then use it everywhere.
Can you go into that a little bit more? You mentioned templates. There's certain sort of let's say structures within env0 that may not be so obvious to the classic
Sure.
sort of DevOps engineer out there.
Absolutely. So we technically have 4 levels of constructs, so to speak. We have the overall organization. That's just, most customers have one. Some service providers might split that between customers, but for the most part, there's just one organization. Within the organization, there's projects. Now, those projects can be, they can organize any way you want. It's kind of a folder, so to speak. So you could have your dev project, or you could have your, prod project. We have some customers that are like, this is my AWS project, this is my Azure project, and that way you can kind of organize that any way you see fit. There's also templates, and with those templates, essentially that's just where you point us at your repository, wherever those TF files or your other infrastructure as code files are. So if you've got like a service, great, point us at the service. If you have a full application, great, point us at that. Whichever bit you need to organize that by, you point us there. And then the smallest construct we have is the environments, and that's the actual deployments. So the way that I like to say is that essentially, if there's a Terraform state file for it, that's an environment.
Gotcha. Okay. So, for example, if there's a folder US West 1, within that would be within the US West 1 folder, you'd expect to find a stateful deployment that would fit into the environment structure.
Exactly right. And like I mentioned, how we don't care what your repository structure is, we'll fit into that. So if you're doing a mono repository and you have all of your different folders for like US East 1, database, and then you have your module, then that would be a template, and that would also be an environment for us. You would create the template off of that module that would then deploy that environment.
Gotcha. Okay, so in the, let's say, there was that great talk by a HashiCorp representative. She was walking us through the different sort of where a team is, along their Terraform lifecycle. I think the end goal was sort of Terra services, where you have, you're unbundling your modules into sort of a modules folder, and then outside of that is where your stateful deployments happen. So the modules would fit into the template structure?
Yeah, so we actually have a couple of different ways you can do that. If you just have a mono repository and you want to create templates off of all those folders, you can do that. Also, we do have a private module registry, so if you want to actually take those modules and load them up, you can do that as well. So that kind of fits into the overall structure of, we're not going to tell you how to do your business, we're just going to help you do it your way.
Right, cool. I was a big TerraGrunt, and still am actually a big TerraGrunt fan. My last company, so the company before last, I actually pushed TerraGrunt, and we were using TerraGrunt. We loved TerraGrunt. It just made it so easy to dry up our code, and also with the latest features they've been pushing, you can dry out almost everything, so that there's not a single line of repetition. Now, with companies that can't make that switch, or they're too invested in the existing ecosystem, their Terraform repo just is thousands of deployments long. How would you suggest that a company like that perhaps adopts env0, but also it gets their first steps in drying out all that code, because it becomes so difficult to maintain, actually.
Right. And that's one of those things where, again, we're not going to tell you how to do your job. We have a lot of customers that like the idea of TerraGrunt, and in all fairness, TerraGrunt was created quite some time ago to solve a very specific problem that Terraform had, which a lot of the problems that TerraGrunt solves now can be solved natively in Terraform. So there's some customers that think they need Terraform or TerraGrunt, and you don't really need to move. But it's one of those things where if you want to dry out your code and you want to do that, we can help you with that by simply importing all of the existing information. You've got all of your deployments that are out there. We can help you pull those workspaces in, run those, and then essentially you just start creating new directories, new templates and stuff like that with a more dry version. At which point you can then go and redeploy in there with the new code, injecting those variables, instead of having that non-dry code with all of those hard-coded variables. It's a multi-step process, and it can be a pain, but because of the fact that we don't care if it's dry or not dry or what have you, go ahead and bring in what you've got, and then go through, and that'll allow you to slowly start working that code out, breaking that down and drying it out.
Cool. Are there any new features coming up on env0 that perhaps you're sharing here at KubeCon today, or any cool new things we can let the audience know about?
Absolutely. So as of this week, we've announced the release of native Kubernetes support. So it's just yet another framework that we're going to be working with. So you've got your Terraforms, your TerraGrunts, your Pulumis, etc. We will now be working directly with Kubernetes deployments. So you go ahead and feed us whatever you want for the kubectl. We'll run that natively and push that out. The good thing with this is that we're now able to start telling the complete story. So with Kubernetes, you want to take your Terraform or your Pulumi, build that cluster up, and as soon as that deployment's done, trigger the workflow to then run the deployments for all of those pods, all those services, and everything that you need to using kubectl. So we can now tell the end-to-end story of instantiating that cluster and then giving it something to do.
Right, exactly. I mean, HashiCorp, of course, has published a Kubernetes provider but unfortunately, it's never quite worked for me, especially in complex. You're not a fan. No, neither am I.
It's not great, and I've called it a dumpster fire a few times, and I may feel bad, but it's just not good. It's really unfortunate.
It is really unfortunate. Their Helm provider is a lot better.
Absolutely.
So if you just have Helm charts to deploy, it's great. But if you're doing things like customize, or you're just deploying plain Kubernetes manifests,
yeah.
I mean, almost inevitably, I dip my toes into it, and I walk away right away.
Not today. Yeah. Just do it the hard way. It's fine.
Exactly. So with env0's new feature, it really plugs in that lifecycle gap, exactly, where you can say, here I'm going to deploy all of this infrastructure, yes, with Terraform, and when this cluster goes up, I want to be sure that my Argo CD operator is running, yep, et cetera, right?
You can do all of that natively from the platform. So that way you're not having to go off and just start using the CLI to work with it, or you don't have to go to another platform. I really hate the single pane of glass thing. It bothers me, but this really helps us tell that end-to-end story for somebody who's going to be deploying and managing a Kubernetes cluster.
Yeah. So what sort of Kubernetes deployment types does it support? Any sort of manifest that you can think of? Does it support customize, for example?
Anything you're going to be able to do in the kubectl, yeah, we're going to be able to support.
Oh, it's amazing. So if one of our viewers wants to get started with env0 today, I know there's a free tier that they can just sort of get their hands wet. What would you recommend? Where should they go? What's a good sort of first step for?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the website is env0.com. We've got that full free tier. You can find the big green button in the top right. We've got tons of documentation if you want to go and check out the YouTube channel as well. I've got a lot of information out there, including a From Zero to Deploy administration guide of really quick videos to help you get started, get going, and be off to the races quickly.